हाय एवरीवन, वेलकम बैक टू माय चैनल। सो कैसे हैं आप सब? आई होप आप सब अच्छे होंगे। सो आज के लेक्चर में हम बात करने वाले हैं सोशलिज्म यानी कि समाजवाद के बारे में। सो विदाउट एनी फर्दर डू लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड। देखिए, सोशलिज्म इकोनॉमिक और पॉलिटिकल सिस्टम को कहा जाता है जहां वर्कर्स प्रोडक्शन के जनरल मींस के ओनर होते हैं, लाइक फैक्ट्रीज, टूल्स, रॉ मटेरियल। तो बेसिकली समाजवाद में जनरल मींस में जो भी प्रोडक्शन होता है उसका यूज सोशल वेलफेयर के लिए किया जाता है, और किसके थ्रू? स्टेट के थ्रू। ओके, अब बात उठती है सोशलिज्म कैपिटलिज्म से किस तरीके से अलग है। इसमें मीन्स ऑफ प्रोडक्शन की ओनरशिप, कंट्रोल और रेगुलेशन स्टेट के थ्रू किया जाता है, जिसकी वजह से पूंजीवाद की तरह समाजवाद में इकोनॉमिक एक्सप्लॉयटेशन की पॉसिबिलिटीज नहीं होती और सोशल वेलफेयर में तेजी होती है, जिसकी वजह से क्या होता है? मैक्सिमम सोशल एडवांटेज स्टेट को मिलता है। इसमें जितना भी प्रोडक्शन होता है सबका कंट्रोल गवर्नमेंट पर होता है। व्हाट टू प्रोड्यूस, हाउ टू प्रोड्यूस, हाउ मच टू प्रोड्यूस एंड हाउ टू डिस्ट्रीब्यूट, ये सब डिसीजन कौन लेती है? गवर्नमेंट लेती है। ओके, और इसमें इकोनॉमिक प्रोसेस को देखने के लिए सेंट्रल प्लानिंग अथॉरिटी बनाई जाती है, और राइट टू प्राइवेट प्रॉपर्टी की ओनरशिप इन्होंने बहुत ही लिमिटेड रखी है। ओके, So, one main objective of the state is taken to be ensure the liberty of property. Right to private property has been regarded by much of the liberal theory as the key to liberty of the individual and to the pursuit of this happiness. So, जितना भी कोई भी इंडिविजुअल अपनी मेहनत से कमा के कोई भी प्रॉपर्टी लेता है तो उसमें उसका पूरी तरीके से राइट होता है। ठीक है, अकॉर्डिंग टू जॉन लॉक। राइट, देखो जितने भी प्रोडक्शन ऑफ मीन्स होते हैं, लाइक लैंड, रॉ मटेरियल्स, टूल्स, ये सब जितने भी होते हैं जो लाइफ की ज़रूरतों और बाकी चीज़ों को पूरा करने में हेल्प करती है, ये सोसाइटी में प्राइवेट ओनरशिप में होते हैं। और प्राइवेट ओनरशिप में सब कुछ बहुत ही एक लिमिटेड जोन तक सिमट कर रह जाता है, जैसे कि कैपिटलिज्म। ओके, well, the doctrine of social progress is predicated on the assumption that the pursuit of rational self-interest by every individual will, over a period of time, even if temporary setbacks have to be faced, lead to social good. This means that general social welfare will be the result of individualism, maximization of interest. This prevailing view of the new man was well captured by Alexander Pope in the following words: thus God or nature form the general frame, and bad self-love and social be the same. We all know Adam Smith oft quoted maximum of the invisible hand. Everyone is not only a maximizer of self-interest, but is an infinite appropriator and an infinite consumer of goods of every kind. Property is the measure of man, and in a capitalist society, whichever way one looks at it, all roots converge on property, and through it the individual's pursuit of his happiness. So what we get as a picture of man under such a social arrangement is an egoistic person, dissociated from all other individuals and all by himself in a space called the marketplace. Okay, so it is clear in the above statement that bourgeois property is exclusively individual and that it legitimates the exclusion of others from it. In feudal property, others members too had entitlements on the fruits of property. In this view of things, there is no sense of an individual's social obligations to others or of sharing in the benefits of a social system in the creation of which people cooperate together. In any complex system, even property is the result of the common exertions of people, but its possession is always exclusively private. The common good is identified with the individual good. The individual good is each man for himself. The state has the function to ensure that those who succeed in acquiring property have full protection. So basically, all the means of production, land, factory, raw material, tools and instrument and such other things which go into the production of necessities of life and other goods in such a society are privately owned. And these get a history shows concentrated in fewer and fewer hands as capitalist production is based on increasing accumulation. This has two very important consequences for society. First, all decisions about investment choices, which commodities to produce and in what quantities, is determined by a small group of people who own these means of production. Whether the commodity is socially beneficial or not is not the main consideration. What determines the investment choices is whether effective demand can be created. In other words, profitability of goods is the sole consideration in the making of choices about investment, whether luxury cars will be produced when there is a crying need for buses. Public transport is left to be decided by the profit motive of the individual entrepreneurs. Same is the case whether guns or bombs should have precedence over the urgent need to have a hospital or a school. Production in society is without any plan and often can be of a wasteful nature. Expensive fatless potato chips can score over the need for cheap bread, which ordinary people may badly require. So distribution following from the above investment choices for wrong kind of commodities goes on regardless of social need or urgency of one who can pay. Okay. Secondly, such an economic system or mode of production creates a class freed from social and legal obligations to perform labor. This is the class of capitalist. It stays out of the labor process and imposes the burden of productive labor on the rest of the society. So we have a large part of society, a majority, who live solely on their wages, which in turn are determined by the cost of reproducing the labor power of the person as well as the demand and supply of labor. We thus find that the capitalist society is sharply divided between those who own the capital and other means of production and those who have nothing but empty hands and sell this labor power under conditions which are loaded against them. Just look around the world to see the truth of this statement. A society with such a class division cannot respect the person who labors. One who labors he deposits as he just survives on the wages he receives. Property and possession is the basis of esteem. All the economic privileges, social predominance and prestige are with those who own the means of production. The capitalist, all of these social assets are means to earn and provide immediate access to political power. That is why the bourgeois in capitalist societies have rightly been called the ruling class, the class with the power to determine the main features of any capitalist society. In sum, we can say that class determines the structure of society, which in turn conditions the values, attitude, actions, and the overall articulation of any civilization. So when we talked in the beginning that socialism has been a revolt or sorts against bourgeois property, it was not just property but the entire system of production and government that the bourgeois property give rise to and imposes on the rest of the society. So, what is the shape that this revolt takes? In other words, what is socialism? In the early decades of the 19th century, the common elements of what was emerging as the socialist outlook were falling in place. So, early socialism did not grow into any clear cut doctrine but a set of values and beliefs held together by the view that private ownership of production should be replaced. But there was no unanimity about replaced by what. There were common currents of thinking that some or other form of common ownership of productive property should be the basis of social organization of society. Socialism is not against property per. For example, owning a flat or a refrigerator or driving in one's own car does not militate against the spirit of socialism. All these are consumable items. When socialism talk against the private ownership of property, it means such property which is productive and yields profit or rental income. That is the private ownership of means of production. Early socialists thought that property is theft. This comes to mean that the owners of means of production cheat the workers, the direct producers, or whatever. So, production which takes place over and above the wages paid to them. This denial of what they produce is theft. The accumulation of this theft is property in the form we see it in our societies. Being a theft, it is morally unacceptable. So it must be abolished, and as a form private ownership must be converted into one or another form of common ownership. The latter socialists did not consider property as a theft, but viewed it as appropriation and accumulation of the surplus value that the worker produces. This process is built into the labor process, which produces goods for exchange in the market. It is therefore internal and structural to the capitalist process, and this is also instituted in law and is therefore legal. So it cannot be theft, but is exploitation, and nevertheless remains from a normative point of view illegitimate, unacceptable. Therefore, they agreed with the early socialists that it must abolished and common social ownership instituted. This common notion about the unwelcome nature of private ownership of the means of production, and following on that, the idea of one or another form of common ownership is what unites the socialist. Anyone who agrees with these views is a socialist, whatever else their differences. This common outlook is well summed up in the following verse. Socialism is that organization of society in which the means of production are controlled, and the decision on how and what to produce and on who is to get what are made by public authority instead of by privately owned and privately managed firms. Within these broad agreements, it is the differences about how does one replace capitalism and what exactly is the version of social ownership which create so many different schools of socialism. There is finally that all important question of how does one arrive at socialism. In other words, who will bring it about? In looking at these questions, we will know the different versions of schools of socialism. In the aftermath of the French Revolution of 1789, two important features changed in the way people related to the world. The French Revolution put into the shape of political agenda the theories of enlightenment, and it furthermore enthroned the value of equality and fraternity as of the same importance as liberty, and thus egalitarianism became a creed with the masses. The second momentous development was the fast emerging working class all over Western Europe in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, a class large and growing in number but living in deep misery. Okay. देखिए सोशलिस्ट प्रॉपर्टी के अगेंस्ट किस तरीके से है ये समझना सबसे ज़्यादा ज़रूरी है. फॉर एग्जांपल आप फ्लैट ले रहे हैं, आप फ्रिज ले रहे हैं, या आप कार लेते हैं, बाइक लेते हैं, या कुछ भी लेते हैं, ये सब आपकी ज़रूरत की चीज़ें हैं. ये सब अगर आप लेते हो तो सोशलिस्ट इसके अगेंस्ट नहीं है, ठीक है. लेकिन मान लीजिए आप एक घर ले रहे हो, ठीक है, आपकी नीड अब पूरी हो चुकी है. अब आप क्या कर रहे हो, 2-3 घर और ले रहे हो और उसे रेंट पर चढ़ा देते हो. वहाँ से आप क्या कर रहे हो, पैसा कमा रहे हो. तो इसके खिलाफ है समाजवाद, ठीक है. अनदर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट फिगर अमंग द अर्ली सोशलिस्ट वॉज प्रोधन. He was the one who explicitly referred to property as theft, and also had a very polemical argument with Marx on the nature of property and poverty. He wrote a book called Philosophy of Property, to which Marx replied with poverty of philosophy, pointing to the inadequacies of his philosophical convictions. One central concern of production, Proudhon once the importance of liberty of the ordinary people. He thought that the greatest obstacle in the way of realization of liberty is inequality. So we can say that equality was sought by Proudhon as a precondition of liberty, and in that sense he is in tune with modern radical ideas. An equalitarian ethos, Proudhon believed, can only be achieved in a classless society, but he shunned the idea of class war of social change. Voluntary agreement of the working people should lead the way towards a classless society. He advocated a nation-wide system of decentralized workers' cooperatives which can bargain with one another for mutual exchange of goods and services. So it is clear from the exposition of the views of the four leading exponents, there were many lesser ones too, that early socialism was not any kind of theory but a festive play of ideas against capitalism and all that it represented. Many of these ideas are still around us in different garbs and exercise considerable influence. Marx was both critical and appreciative of these writings of socialism. He critically referred to them as purely utopian in character. What is utopian about these for Marx? There is, first of all, no conception of revolutionary action. What are the forces within the capitalist society who will fight to replace it? How they will fight? Instead, what we have, secondly, is an assortment of vague and diffuse ideas. All the early socialists were conceptualists of class struggle waged by the working class. They all talked of, as we have seen above, voluntary agreements, change of heart, propaganda, and practical carrying out of social plans. Personal inventive actions, small experiments expanding into society wide activity, even while all agreed that the working class is the most suffering class, but that the entire society be convinced through peaceful means of the need to replace capitalism without distinction of class. Alright, now Karl Marx and socialism. So, Marx important in the history of struggle. Socialism lies in the fact that he was the first man who could propound a theory of socialism, which could, as noted earlier, revive and stand on an equal footing with the theory of capitalism developed by Ricardo and Adam Smith. Marx did not simply propound a theory in the old style, but developed a doctrine which unified, or at least so he claimed, theory was practice such that theory could guide practice and practice could rectify the errors in theory. In short, what Marx did was to build up a theory of revolutionary action, identify the class which will carrying out the revolutionary task of replacing capitalism with socialism. So, in general, historically, theory of in what has now come to the known as historically materialism, why and how human societies change, and what further changes are in store for human society. Marx showed that historical change is neither accidental nor a result of sheer will, that it has laws which are dialectical. Contradiction is the essence of dialectics. This contradiction is not logical. Okay, so this fact of contrary pulls or oppositions within a reality impulses a movement in reality. In other words, societies changes because of its inner contradictory pulls towards evolving stages. Like in other earlier stages, feudalism, for example. So in capitalism, it is internal contradiction which propel it towards change into something else. Okay, every mode of production, sum total of forces and relations of the production gives rise to two classes in perpetual opposition to each other. One is the ruling or the exploiting class, and the other is the oppressed or the exploited class. The constant conflict and opposition between these two classes. Many other versions like guild socialism and syndicalism and so on are also there, but we will not deal with these as these are by now unimportant and can also be easily read in any chapter on socialism in a standard theory book. When the workers' revolution did not take place, as Marx had foreseen that it soon will, there emerged strong reservations about Marxism as a body of doctrines. One who expressed this in systematic terms was the long-time German Marxist Edward Bernstein. In a book entitled Evolutionary Socialism, Lie elaborated a wholly different route to and tactics for achieving a socialist society. The other line of development took shape not because revolution did not come about, but because a large group of British socialists had intrinsic reservations about Marxism. They thought some of its goals and methods and tactics will result in authoritarian, despot politics. They took exceptions to goals like the dictatorship of the proletariat class welfare, violent overthrow of capitalism, etc. To further an alternative way of achieving socialism together with strengthening democracy, letting socialists form themselves into a Fabian society in the middle of the 1880s, and this version eventually came to be known as Fabian socialism. Important name within this tradition are Sydney and Beatrix Webb, GDH, Cole Bernard, Sholaski, Tony, and many others. Remember that some leading Indian nationalist leaders led by Nehru during the freedom struggle were deeply influenced by this current, and which after interdependence gave birth to in the middle of 1950s to the idea of socialist party, pattern of society. So basically, Bernays argued that wages of workers are not falling but are relatively rising because the rate of profit is not, as Marx argued, declining, and therefore the expected impoverishments of the workers and the consequent uprising will not come about. Rather, the workers would get more and more integrated into the capitalist system. Hence, the need is to work within the capitalist system by accepting its institutional framework of parliament, elections, open political activity, and thereby striving to improve the condition of the working class. Through the different routes, these two critics of Marxism came to similar conclusions, which can be stated as the core tenets. Democratic socialism, for of these deserve I mention. First, socialism is not, as Marx thought, a historical necessity or inevitable, but a moral need for the good of humanity. Humanity can realize its potential only within a radical egalitarian ethos. For this to happen, people will have to be won over for socialism and parliamentary majorities gained by carrying political education among the masses. It is therefore important to realize, secondly, that in a transition to socialism, it is not only the working class but the entire people who will play a part. Working class, as the predominant part of the world, will no doubt be strategic, but middle classes too can be imbued with socialist ideas and can play a major role in building public opinion. Thirdly, the route to socialism will not be through a violent rupture, as Marx thought, but would be by a gradual ascent. In this, by degrees, through closely interconnected legislative measures, the structure of socialist economy can be put in place. Equal opportunity of effective participation in the running of the state, corporation, rather than competition, equality to fully develop human personality, and similar other values will become norms of society. And lastly, the state will remain an institution of strategic importance. Through a series of nationalization measures, the state will ensure that the private ownership of the means of production will be socialized, that is, different forms of state and cooperative ownerships in industry and public services like healthcare, education, electricity, railways, etc., will be instituted. Everybody will thus have equal access and entitlement to goods and services. That is how the planned economy of public ownership of the means of production, together with the deepening of democracy and freedom of intellect, will be the way for the emancipation of humanity. So, socialism is no simple monolithic doctrine like Soviet communism was. It represents a variation upon variation, a multiplicity of viewpoints, but as we have seen, sharing some core assumptions and presuppositions. One such presupposition is that every human being is capable of making an equal contribution to the common good, and this can be this can only be done when human beings exert together for common welfare. Socialism is a special form of democracy which extends the idea of freedom from civil and political rights to equal claims on economic well being and social status. And this can only be achieved when human beings cease to be egoistically competitive as under capitalism. So long as capitalism is there, with it exploitation and disregard for human dignity in favor of efficiency of production and market equilibrium, the yearning for socialism will be there. The revolt against bourgeois property will not come to an end. Now here are some important questions. First, explain what is socialism. This is very important question for master's level, not in bachelor's level. Let me clear two things. First one is socialism is important for master's level, not bachelor's level. So make sure you are preparing well. Now next question is write an essay on the doctrine of social progress in the context of individualism and capitalism. Third question is discuss any two early trends in socialism. Discuss Karl Marx's theory of socialism. Examine the critics of Marxism. Describe the line features of democratic socialism. So these all questions are very important for your master's level if you are pursuing masters in political science, if you have political theory. So guys, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, kindly hit the like button and do subscribe my YouTube channel. See you in the next lecture. Till then, bye bye, take care.